Good afternoon. I'm happy to be here today to share some of my research findings with you. And before I start, let me acknowledge the input of two of my research team members, Dr. Dan Way, who has worked with me closely for several years on these studies, and Jay Zhu, a PhD student here in the Price School. Thank you. So I'm going to focus on the macroeconomic impacts of renewable portfolio standards and start off by noting that this has really become quite a polarizing issue. And the question is, are RPSs job killers or job creators? And so we have many claims and counterclaims. Some are well-intended but naive. They're fairly superficial analyses or lacking adequate information. Others are self-serving, people wanting to promote a certain technology or defend a certain technology. And so what I want to do is review our findings from some in-depth studies on these macro impacts. And in most cases, the bottom line is that an RPS will yield some modest economic gains. So everybody knows what an RPS is. I don't have to go through bullet one, but one thing that's fascinating is currently 29 states plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico have an RPS in place. In addition, there are 8 states who have some goals with regard to an RPS codified as well. However, there's an amazing variation across these states in terms of targets, compliance dates, eligible sources, administration, and linkage to other policies such as offset policies. This is an example for 4 of the states we've studied, Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and the mystery state, which is there because we've only done preliminary work and we can't really release that. But if you go down each of the columns, you will see quite a contrast. For instance, Florida, not surprisingly, has a big target within their mix with respect to biomass, also a large one with respect to solar voltaics. On the other hand, states like Michigan and Pennsylvania have a lot of wind energy in their mix, and the mystery state's a little more balanced. There are several types of renewables missing from this sheet, and that doesn't mean they're not part of the general mix, it's just that they're not part of the mix for these 4 states. And geothermal is an interesting example because it implies that what we have here is an emphasis on nearer-term technologies that are well-known, that are validated and can be put in place. California obviously has a large geothermal element to its RPS, and that's because there are prime locations for geothermal energy in California. But there have been studies over the last 20 years that suggest any place in the U.S. can, in fact, be a source of geothermal energy if you use the right technology. But those technologies are a little bit farther out in time. This is a summary of 7 studies my research team has done over the last 4 years on the macroeconomic impacts of climate action plans. And in each of these states, there's an RPS. So, and one of the things that's interesting about this is the variation of the type of government agencies. You've got an executive agency in Florida, you've got 2 environmental agencies next, then you've got a public service commission, an energy agency. We were also funded by a foundation in California, and then finally we're currently doing some work for the Southern California Association of Governments. As far as the macroeconomic analysis, essentially this is built on a solid foundation looking at the micro effects of an RPS or any greenhouse gas mitigation option on individual firms and households. The data for this comes from a variety of sources, government statistics, experts. In many of the states, what happens is that stakeholder groups are formed, comprised of technical experts from all walks of society who sit around the table and identify sources of options to mitigate greenhouse gases and then do an assessment of their potential in terms of how much greenhouse gas emissions can be mitigated and also what their cost effectiveness is, the cost per ton or 1,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And so the key aspects, just two of several, but the two key ones are whether these mitigation options, in this case renewables, are in fact cost incurring or cost saving with regard to what they replace. Also, do they substitute away from existing products, or do they increase spending in the case of cost savings? These are then fed into a macro model that I'll talk about in a moment, which captures various linkages and interaction effects. For instance, if you increase renewables, you're obviously going to displace and reduce fossil energy generation. So that's going to have a dampening effect. You're going to have an investment stimulus due to the installation of new equipment. You're going to have quantity and price multipliers in the economy and a resource reallocation as a result of that. The most influential factors that we've identified are grouped on this slide into two categories: those on the upside, in other words, those that promote a beneficial or positive impact of an RPS, and these are things like a projection of increasing future fossil energy prices. There are several people who would argue that in this very moment, many renewable technologies are not, in fact, economically viable, but that, in fact, if we look into the future, the projection is that energy prices will, in fact, increase fairly significantly, and they may very likely be viable in the future. At the same time, in the last year or two, we've seen the ascendance of gas from shale deposits in the Midwest and eastern United States, which might, in fact, have some stabilizing effect on energy prices. So it is as much of an art as a science to make some of these projections and to factor those in, because we're not just looking in these analyses at the current price situation, but what the future holds. It also depends on the extent to which we have cost-saving technologies and that those continue to be developed through learning and economies of scale. We can expect many of these renewable technologies to become even more cost-effective over time. As I mentioned before, there's an investment stimulus in the economy as a result of implementing them. And there's also the possibility at the individual state level to enhance your positive economic impacts by attracting new green manufacturing and support industries into the state. On the downside, we've got several factors as well. And as I mentioned before, you're going to have a decline in fossil electricity generation, but in many states, for instance, a state like Pennsylvania, you're also going to have a decrease in coal mining activity. So you would expect that factor to be much stronger in a state like Pennsylvania with fossil energy, especially coal, than a state like Florida that generates a lot of electricity from gas and coal, but simply imports it. So when those facilities close down, the hit is mollified significantly. You also have an investment displacement effect with respect to the need to have investment funds for renewable generation might in fact draw from otherwise ordinary investment in the economy, and the extent to which you can attract investment funds from out of state will in fact help mute that negative impact, or the extent to which you can access retained earnings in a healthy economy from companies within the state. And finally, when you displace ordinary investment in plant and equipment, it's not just the reduction in the capital investment goods that are produced, but you also forego potential productivity gains of that investment in the economy. And so all of these things have to be factored into our analysis. So let's start off with the microeconomic picture. This is the situation for four of the states that I would like to emphasize again. And what we have here on the cost effectiveness in the last column is that it's a cost savings of $29 per ton of CO2 equivalent emissions reduced in that state from the implementation of an RPS in that state, meaning that you save $29 a ton in that state. In Pennsylvania, there's also a cost savings. On the other hand, Michigan and our mystery state would be cost incurring. And again, why would Florida likely have such a more positive outlook in the micro side? Well, for a couple of reasons. an extensive biomass resource just there for the taking in terms of waste biomass. Also, you can't think of a state better suited to solar energy or to wind energy than Florida. Pennsylvania is a little harder to explain, but if we have some time later on, I can do that. So these cost effectiveness measures are a key ingredient in predicting what the final outcome would be in terms of job stimulation or job cessation. We feed those microeconomic factors into a sophisticated macroeconomic model called the REMI, or Regional Economic Models Incorporated Policy Insight Plus model. It's a structural economic forecasting and policy analysis model used widely through the U.S. It, in fact, is the most widely used off-the-shelf macroeconometric model in the country. Every state in the U.S. has one of these that's used in some government agency in that state. It integrates the best features of several modeling approaches, such as input-output and computable general equilibrium analysis. It is dynamic and provides a forecasting baseline for us, and also includes behavioral responses to changes in wages, prices, and regulations. So it's a very complex model with thousands of equations, but the 5 blocks listed there indicate that it includes, all of the major components of an economy. And I might also say the bottom 3 of those get at a key feature, and that is the competitiveness of the state that is implementing the policy with respect to other states. One of the great fears is that if we, as a given state, adopt an RPS, it's cost incurring, that's going to hurt our competitive edge with respect to our neighboring states. Well, here are some results for the 4 states that I've mentioned, and looking at 2020, because that, in fact, is an example of a case where all states have that target. We can see that the impacts in terms of jobs are positive in each of these 4 states for this base case. They're pretty high in this case of Florida, on the order of 23,000 jobs, and the lowest is Michigan, on the order of just slightly under 2,000 jobs. In terms of percentages of the state's economy, 23,000 jobs is a lot in absolute terms, but it's pretty small in relative terms. It's really only 0.2% in the state of Michigan in the year 2020, and 10 times the percentage amount in the XX state here on this sheet. I might also say that these numbers represent our results for a more optimistic set of assumptions and factors that I've talked about a moment ago. But what I'd like to do is talk about the sensitivity analysis that we typically perform on these results to identify the factors that have the greatest influence and to see whether our assumptions are reasonable and our results are robust. So the zero investment displacement case is exhibited here for our mystery state. And what it shows in the year 2030, we're talking about the creation of 3,500 net jobs. I mean, there are many more jobs created in relation to the RPS in the economy, but there are offset by job declines in gas production in the state, other ordinary electricity generation. So this is the zero investment displacement effect, which assumes that all the investment that goes into an RPS is additive, that it comes from federal subsidies, that it comes from out-of-state investment, or it comes from retained earnings. It is not displacing any ordinary investment in plant and equipment in any of these industries or in the electric utility industry. So what we've done here is gone through a set of sensitivity tests, and the most pessimistic set of assumptions yields us this 100% displacement case, where none of this investment is additive. It all displaces ordinary investment. And we still come up with a positive impact in the year 2030, but if we're concerned about what happens in 2020, earlier on, we do have a negative effect on job growth. Now, and then we've got cases in between where we assume a 50-50% displacement of investment. We've also factored in productivity gains and assumptions relating to avoided capital costs, and you can see those numbers are intermediate. Now, I could have also shown you the numbers with respect to effects on gross state product, and those tend to be similar but not as positive. And in fact, we wind up in several of our states under the very pessimistic scenarios with some negative overall impacts. Why are the job impacts higher than the gross state product impacts? Well, the reason is because the RPS is in fact more labor intensive than what it displaces, and hence you're going to do better job-wise than you are with respect to ordinary economic activity. This is another depiction of the decomposition analysis that we perform. We have our various considerations, the extent of reduced electricity imports, construction investment, equipment investment, et cetera, all stimulating the economy, and then we have our negative effects, decreased demand for coal, decreased demand for oil and gas in the state, and the overall net effect is the solid line, which reflects that. This is actually the 50-50 case, so it reflects about 2,500 jobs in the economy in the year 2030. So just to conclude, then, there are many factors that influence the job impacts of an RPS. They're both reinforcing and offsetting factors, and we've been able to quantify most of those factors. The ones that are most variable are factors like the price of fossil energy, technological change in renewable technologies, and industrial location. On the downside, the most variable are the lost productivity from displaced investment and fossil energy, and that should read displacement, not development. The complexities, though, require an analysis on a case-by-case basis. I've mentioned the bottom line, but really, for the purpose of legislation and to really evaluate these, you really do need to evaluate them on a case-by-case basis. We found that an RPS in most states will stimulate modest job growth. And finally, I'll add one more bullet to these. These results are actionable. In other words, you don't have to necessarily take these as a given. If you're a state or a region implementing the policy, there are various things you can do to make these impacts more positive. And those are investing in research and development in alternative technologies, attracting new industry into the state so that increases the multipliers, keeps more of the investment funds and economic activity in your state. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's open it up to questions then.
Well, I have a question for you, and that is, you say your conclusion is that an RPS stimulates modest job growth, and most of the RPSs that I'm assuming are pretty similar. You know, I mean, looking at California's a 33% goal overall, and so my question is, if some RPS is good, can you tell from your research whether more RPS would be better?
Yeah, that's tough because, and one would say that what you get are diminishing returns, to use an economics term, and that's typical in the world, that as you add and increase some activity, what you bring online are the best options first and the lowest cost options, and then as you increase, you have less low-hanging fruit. You have to strain more and the costs go up. So the early displacements are the ones that have the greatest increment of benefits, and after a while, that increment narrows significantly. Working the other direction, there are factors such as learning and economies of scale that would, in fact, help on the positive side, but I would say it's going to get tougher as we go up that renewable ramp to keep these positive impacts in place near term. Long term, there's a lot that can happen, but near term, it can be tough. Chris, do you want to?
Yes.
Yeah, on the same line, have you done a study on distributed generation? Because usually RPS is like large scale, and there is a difference, you know, with the distributed generation. have you done a study on the impacts on jobs on DG versus large scale? And I don't mean to say up against it. I
Right.
apologize. I just wondering if you could tell me a bit.
Well, we have in the following way. As I said, most of our studies don't just focus on RPS. They focus on anywhere from 20 to 45 different options to mitigate greenhouse gases. And these include things like cogeneration and some types of distributed generation. And in most cases, we found those to have positive effects on economic activity.
Well, now that you're mentioning with the comparison, how does having this standard so that you have to come in with renewable power, how does that compare in your studies to a cap and trade system where there's no necessary mandate that it's going to be renewable power by the electricity generators, but there's a much broader set of options for getting your underneath that cap?
Okay. Well, Chris has asked a loaded question in a sense that he's a good economist too, and what he's getting at is that economic principles suggest that it's more efficient to simply set a reduction target and let entities that emit meet that target in whatever way they want with free choice than to tell them exactly how to do it. And the main reason is you open yourself up to a larger set of options. You may also increase compliance with this freedom of choice. So in principle, that is a factor. In theory, one could say, hey, it could even be more efficient if we simply told the utilities they had to cut back a certain amount and they decided how to do it. When most of the RPSs came out, there really was this concern about the escalating price of fossil energy over time, and there weren't that many good alternatives. Now people are saying, well, natural gas-fired generation could in fact be a good alternative. But remember, natural gas does use only 60%, or does generate only 60% of the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, that coal does. But it's still fossil energy, and so there's a limit to what we can reduce shifting to gas. The other factor that's often forgotten, though, in the real world situation is that the difference between what we call price responsive and non-price responsive options. So a cap and trade system is pretty good, but it only works if you're talking about mitigation activities that respond to a price signal. And a lot of things don't, and the reason are various types of market failure, especially on the part of individual decision makers, businesses, or firms, and it ranges from why they don't undertake energy conservation or energy efficiency improvements that are in their own best interests. And the reasons are things like myopia. There's a very short recapture period for an investment. There's also limited access to credit markets for some individuals. There are principal agent problems. There's a mindset in certain industries which is not oriented toward change and energy efficiency, but simply maintaining the status quo or a building mentality. So there are a lot of reasons why in the real world cap and trade is only going to go so far, and you really need to supplement it with some regulations, some forcing. And there have been a lot of examples of technology forcing. The classic example is the CAFE standards in the automobile industry, where the industry was just not going to undertake those changes themselves. And the forcing has, in fact, led over time to improved technology that has actually benefited the industry. I think even most industry people would say that today. They wouldn't have said it 20 years ago.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
I was just interested in the job figure. I think you said 23,000 in Florida by 2015 or something of that nature.
Right, maybe it might have been 35,000.
Yeah. I'm just interested where you see the majority of those new jobs coming.
Oh, that's a good question, and I should have actually shown that. I had thought about that. So obviously the construction sector and the manufacturing of new renewable technology are some of the best real estate. These tend to be land intensive, and just retail trade, because when more money goes into people's pockets, they buy more goods and services, so there's a retail trade margin. So, and professional and scientific service industries, those tend to be about the five major ones.
And then just the flip side to that, what are those industries and jobs most impacted by an RPS standard where losses occur, and how do you even up, if you will, these new jobs in terms of net economic benefit versus the loss of the historical employment?
Sure. Well, in Florida, for example, the biggest loser by a long shot was the electric utility industry. This wasn't just of the RPS, this was the overall package, because there was a lot of energy efficiency. In terms of lost jobs, and others were some transportation-related sectors, and I can't recall the others. In Pennsylvania, it was coal mining job, for example. So it is an unfortunate situation. I personally, and professionally too, will often look at the distribution of these outcomes and suggest that just saying on net it's got a positive outcome isn't really good enough. I think we do need to be concerned about people whose jobs we've displaced. And there have been attempts to do something about that. The concern is that it opens a Pandora's box. Senator Robert Byrd, 20 years ago, tried to pass legislation anticipating climate change regulation, suggesting sort of a federal subsidies to displaced mine workers. And it was shot down, not that it was not meritorious, but again, that people were concerned that it would set a precedent such that every time there was a federal or state policy passed and there were losers from it, that they would go forth and require that subsidy. So it's a tough issue.
One last question, yes.
Yeah, just a real quick question, but I'm curious because I read about this in other places. I didn't see wave power anywhere on anybody's portfolio. Is that something that's real, or?
I'm not the technologist. I'll defer to the engineers.
I think it's a long ways away. Based on a couple of bids we got in the 2011 RPS solicitation.
I see. So you've actually gotten some interest, but you don't feel it's ready for prime time?
Well, I'm not qualified to speak on the technology, but there are certainly some questions around that, and the costs were certainly prohibitive.
Interesting. Thank you.
I was, actually, I had one backup slide, but I'm out of slideshow. Anyway, I was gonna show you the states that have been past the RPS. It's quite interesting. It's really only the Southeast and a couple of Midwestern states that are lagging.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists on this first panel. It's really learned a lot. Thank you very much.